Welcome to answering Pope Leo's Nonviolent Appeal, the latest event in the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence seminar series in Rome. As Marie said, my name is Ken Budigan. I'm the co-director of the Institute, and I'm thankful that we have three esteemed scholars on nonviolent resistance to present today. The Catholic Institute for Nonviolence is a project of Pax Christi International's Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. Pax Christi is a worldwide Catholic network of over 100 organizations across 6 continents working for peace, justice, and reconciliation. For 80 years, Pax Christi members around the world, including many living in contexts of violence, injustice, and war, have fostered a deep commitment to active nonviolence. The Catholic Institute for Nonviolence exists to make nonviolence research, publications, resources, and experience more accessible to Catholic Church leaders, communities, and institutions. In light of this mission, we're grateful for the vision and prophetic stance of Pope Leo XIV, who has, in his first moments as pontiff, emphasized that nonviolence is at the core of the gospel. After blessing the entire world with the phrase Jesus shared with the disciples after his resurrection, "Peace be with you all," Pope Leo broke open its meaning by proclaiming that Christ's peace is unarmed and disarming, humble and persevering. In short, it is nonviolent. In his Easter message, he reinforced that when he said the power with which Christ rose was entirely nonviolent. And in his first year, he proclaimed peace and nonviolence 400 times. Today's seminar answers Pope Leo's nonviolent appeal in a very particular way by exploring the ways strategies of nonviolence work. Even though God calls us to nonviolence, whatever the consequences, we are living in an exciting time when scholars worldwide are discovering through quantitative research that it is effective as well as the right thing to do morally. I'm going to now ask the director of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, Nicholas Paz, to come forward and to introduce our speakers and facilitate our seminar. Please welcome Nicholas Paz.
Well, thank you all for being here, and for the ones who will see us later on the recording. It's really an honor, and I'm really excited to have these 3 great scholars and these three great researchers on nonviolence. And I feel especially excited because these are the kind of people that every time I'm talking and training on nonviolence, I'm quoting them. So it's really great to have them here. On nonviolence, we talk many times. We say many times that it's a process where we also need like a new epistemology, to deal with it. So that we need to think together, to think out loud. So I will encourage both the speakers, but also you that are here to bring your own questions, your own critiques, your own reflections to them, so we can really have a conversation among all of us. Today we do have here Kathleen Gallagher, Jonathan Pinky, and Cécile Duvernet. And I will introduce them. and we will have a presentation of each one of them, and then we will have a discussion. And so you can bring all your questions. As each one of them has a big curriculum, each one needs its own presentation. So I will start first with Kathleen, and then I will introduce you to Jonathan and Cecile when they introduce themselves. So Kathleen Gallagher is a professor of the Department of Government and Politics in the University of Maryland, and she's affiliated with the Center for International Development and Conflict Management. Her current research examines how crises, particularly climate change, reshape governance and authority relationships globally. She focuses on non-state actor governance, asking when and why armed groups, rebel organizations, and other non-state actors govern where states cannot or will not. Her broader research interests include self-determination movements, civil war, and nonviolent resistance. Her latest book, which I recommend, is Rebel Governance in the Age of Climate Change. And she's also the author of Inside the Politics of Self-Determination. Her work has appeared in, well, some of the most leading journals, and she received her PhD from the University of California. So please welcome Dr. Gallagher.
Thank you so much for having me. It is, despite having probably gotten a cold on the plane, a real delight to be here and to talk to this community. I will actually, should we put, I have some slides. Oh yes, okay, perfect. I'm gonna present today sort of accumulation of the work that I've done on nonviolent resistance. As Sig noted, I have more recently been working on climate change and the hazards that this creates and the social challenges, which I think actually intersect very strongly with both the role of the church in society and nonviolent resistance. So if the conversation goes that way, I will be delighted if anybody has thoughts on that. But let me begin with a short presentation of the work that I've done and how I think about nonviolent resistance. And I'm delighted to have two colleagues here who I think bring different perspectives on this, sort of aligned, but from unique angles. So I think it's going to be a really, really exciting set of presentations. Okay, so I want to start with just a short acknowledgement of a real-world case. I will be presenting some statistical findings and data, which is primarily the way that I do work, but I think it's important to put this in context. And I start with this, this group, the Ogoni in Nigeria. This is a historic movement for national self-determination. So it's an ethnic minority that wants autonomy. They have been and historically have lived in a context of repression. And I shared with you a quote today from the first president of the MOSOP, sort of contextualizing what their demands are. And this is an organization that has a real commitment to nonviolence and to calling attention to their cause through the use of nonviolent resistance. For those of you that are familiar with some of the work on nonviolence, sometimes the phrase, or violence too, sometimes the phrase of like marketing your movement is used. There was an influential book, Marketing of Rebellion. And here we see a case where the group really focuses on their nonviolent resistance tactics as a way to reach populations. So this group made explicit calls to the American government, to the European community, and actually enshrined the use of nonviolent tactics in their Bill of Rights. Right? So it's a group that's struggling in a very difficult context where many other similar groups use violence, and they really focus on the use of nonviolence. One of the reasons that I want to start with this example is because of their approach to solidarity, right? And to trying to bring people to the movement, not through giving them arms, not through giving them money, but through identifying with them and their quest for greater autonomy. I want to contrast this case with what we typically think of in terms of nonviolent resistance. A lot of the work that we see and a lot of the really notable examples are these really enormous influential campaigns of nonviolence. So we're talking about actors like Gandhi, the American Civil Rights Movement, the People Power Movement. And these are really central movements for us to understand and to learn from in terms of thinking about the power of nonviolence. But the question I ask here is really a step away from that, a step towards the group I began with, a small population, a group that's not going to be able to mobilize a significant number of people into the streets. And to ask this question, does nonviolence work? Quick preview, yes, it works. It would be really a surprise if I answered no, it does not work. Yes, it works, but maybe even more importantly, or sort of, is this question of how does it work, right? How and when does it work? So these are the types of groups that we, I think, need to consider, and particularly as we think about, in different communities, how do we support nonviolence and the use of nonviolence? Really thinking, what does this community come to the table with, right? Are they bringing the potential for mass mobilization? In a lot of cases, the answer is no, right? So how can nonviolence be useful? How can it be seen as effective for smaller communities? Okay. So the conventional wisdom really focuses on the way that nonviolence works in a very large, sort of overwhelming context. There's a really influential book, I'm sure many of you know, we talked about it this morning at length, by Chenoweth and Stephan, one of the first quantitative studies to compare head-to-head mass nonviolence and civil conflict or violent campaigns. And in that study, they show that nonviolence beats out violence, right? That it's more effective for understanding when groups are going to succeed in achieving their aims. This was a really fantastic study. It has spawned a great deal of work by myself and many others. And I think it also, for my purposes, had really important limitations. Not through the fault of the study, but just in terms of as an initial foray into a quantitative understanding of nonviolence, they could focus on one set of types of nonviolence. And so my work in the subsequent years, both working with Erica Chenoweth and others, has really focused on these, what I call these sort of two measurement problems. The first is this initial look at mass nonviolent campaigns, I think was incredibly useful. All of us that lived through the Arab Spring, that have seen mass mobilization, do see the power of this, and I think we also see the limitations of it, and then this has sort of continued over time. And so one of the early things that I wanted to do in advancing our understanding of nonviolence is to look beyond mass campaigns, right? What's happening when you don't have hundreds of thousands of people? The second sort of measurement problem that I address actually comes from my earlier work. Before I focused on nonviolence, I did a great deal of work on self-determination movements and claims for national self-determination. What I learned in the decade that I worked on that was that secession is exciting to talk about, but it's not even always what people are asking for, right? This is a sort of externally identified way to approach it and sort of make a problem exciting. And I think this is true for nonviolent resistance as well, right? The focus in some of the early studies was really on what we call maximal goals. They were super explicit about this, right? A success was a secession or it was a regime change, right? Those are huge events, structural change in governance and society. But that's not often what people are looking for. There are many other types of demands people are making. And particularly if we look at these contexts of more severe repression, I think it's really important to look at these other kinds of claims. how can people improve their lives on a day-to-day basis? How can we move the needle on political change in meaningful ways that make people's lives better in the absence of total regime change, right, or the creation of a new state? So these are the two sort of turning points that I focused on in my own research. And I'll just give you a really short example as to why I think this approach is meaningful. I had an opportunity to have, in one of my courses that I taught on nonviolence, a Tibetan activist come and speak to the class. And the success that he talked about was essentially the prevention of an art exhibit traveling around the United States showing off sort of Tibetan art that was done by the Chinese government. Now, that's not what we would call a maximal success, right? That's not regime change. That's not Tibet getting their own state. But for him, it was a really meaningful concession that was made, right? This was a real success for his movement. Okay. So working from these two starting points, right? Thinking beyond maximal outcomes, thinking beyond mass nonviolence. In my own work, over the course of a number of years and with a number of colleagues, we essentially created a new data project in order to try to understand when and how nonviolence at a smaller scale might work. And in doing this, we created a data project. It's called the Strategies of Resistance Data Project. It actually collects information on both violent and nonviolent tactics, so we can make comparisons across those. And instead of looking at these mass movements that have succeeded to the point where you've got a lot of people in the street, we look at organizations that are making claims. They don't even have to use nonviolence or violence. They could be pursuing their goals through completely conventional politics. And what this allows us to do is to look at a broad set of organizations working all for sort of similar outcomes. These are all autonomy-related movements across a large set of countries and across a large set of time. And this also lets us look at this overtime change, which I'll highlight as well. One of the things that was very exciting to me early in the project is, in collecting this new data, is to find out, which, sort of people who work in nonviolence know this already, but to be able to say this with the data is that nonviolence is common. It's not exceptional, right? There's nonviolence happening in a lot of different contexts in a lot of different places. About 75% of these movements for autonomy that I'm interested in use nonviolence, and more organizations use nonviolence than use violence. Right? So even in this set of cases that I would argue, have been characterized as somewhat inherently violent, right? These independence movements, these secessionist movements, even in that context, there's more nonviolence than violence. And this new data allowed us to look at a number of different kinds of methodologies of nonviolence, data on sit-ins, boycotts, voting boycotts, economic boycotts, hunger strikes, to really dive into what organizations are doing on the ground. A few of the findings I think are relevant to this group is that this idea of the dichotomy between violence and nonviolence really masks a lot of interesting activity and variation that's going on. So in one of the works that I did, we focused on tactical diversity and diffusion. Right? So if we're thinking about whether and how nonviolence is going to be used, it's not just protests. We actually see all different types of nonviolent tools being used, and across broad movements, they work together and they complement one another, right? So we see some diversification of tactics. Importantly, as we look at the trajectory over time, more organizations move from violence to nonviolence than go the other direction. And to me, this was really a sort of stark finding that challenged the way that a lot of scholars of political violence think about violence. They think about violence as a last resort, right? And so this would suggest that that's not true, that people move the other direction, and that's quite, I think, quite important. Okay. So what do we learn from this new data? Let me talk you through a few of the sort of headline results here. The first that comes from the project is again focusing on this, thinking about these two measurement problems is on the idea of maximal goals. So instead of asking about whether or not groups achieved their total goal, I was able to collect new data and investigate, did they get something of what they wanted? And so I broadly conceptualize this as concessions to the movement. And I think this is a really important way to think about how we understand, is nonviolence working? We don't want to look just at the end goal, but instead the progress that can be made towards these goals. And so in my work focused on these autonomy-seeking movements, I just put a few examples here of the types of concessions that are given. Things like policies around language, policies around religious tolerance, giving groups more autonomy. None of these are a maximal win, right? But they are meaningful wins for populations who are seeking greater political control. Now, one of the things that I want to note is that when I look at this broad set of cases, not just maximal nonviolent or mass nonviolence and violence, but look at it at an organizational level, is that both nonviolence and violence can lead to change, right? This is not to say that violence never works and nonviolence always works. I think that's too stark a distinction, and it's sort of if that's being billed to you, there's probably less complexity than you want. But if we look carefully and we look over time and we look at these small movements and the kinds of things they're asking for and what they're getting, we do see that nonviolence is more effective than violence, right? This returns us to the big headline finding from the Chenoweth and Steppen book that looks at mass movements, is that nonviolence works better than violence, right? So we're showing this similar pattern in a different context. So why does that happen? The mass nonviolence studies really hinge, I think importantly, on people power, on high numbers, on pressuring the state, on delegitimizing the state. And that's not something that small-scale nonviolence is well-suited to. So I think we need to tell a different story about how these smaller acts of nonviolence can actually impact and lead to this change that we see empirically. The work that I have done on this really centers on the international community as playing a big role in this. And this, if we return to our opening example of this small group making appeals to big actors in the international community, you can see sort of where this happens in practice. Using nonviolence, particularly when you pair it with a framing around human rights, and this is something we see a lot coming out of the church, I looked for some quotes from Pope Leo as I was preparing this, and he says a lot about human rights and about nonviolent resistance. These things are often talked about together. And when you're bringing those two things together, in contrast to something like violence and human rights, you have the opportunity to create solidarity and create pressure on these governments, often that are repressing citizens, and on the actors that can help affect these changes. The solidarity typically takes the form of naming and shaming, so being public about what's happening in different contexts, calling attention to rights violations, but also calling attention to the nonviolent means through which organizations and people seek change. But it can also come from a broader international community in terms of limiting the ability of states that do these things to their people to enjoy the benefits of community in an international setting. So conditionality of international governmental organizations, membership, things like that. This is often talked about in the political science literature as the boomerang effect, right? This is something that probably 30 years ago became sort of a common term to use, which is activists and citizens, people on the ground, are using nonviolence and they're making their claims. These are picked up by international actors. These are amplified by those outside of the struggle, and that attention comes back to the dispute and essentially works to pressure for change. This idea of an alternative pathway through which nonviolence works, I think is a really important one to keep in the forefront of our minds. Primarily because in this context, as we think through this, both the data shows us and as we look at this new pathway, it works without mass participation. Right? You don't have to have hundreds of thousands of people to get this type of attention, to get this type of pressure, and to eventually get some success. There's a set of factors that sort of make this more likely, and we can sort of talk through how we think about that. But ultimately, I think the sort of bottom line is there's a potential for nonviolence to play a role in improving people's lives, even if that nonviolence looks like sit-ins, right? Small protests, nonviolence that doesn't occupy the streets for days, but that instead is a persistent demand that's happening to gain attention and to gain greater rights. Okay. Just to back this up with the data, and I'm happy to talk more about data. I try to talk less about data rather than more. These are just the probabilities that you're going to get different change here. And just a quick highlight is essentially what I've said before, that nonviolence is as or more effective than violence in leading to these types of concessions. Should have got to that slide earlier. Okay. Sorry, I really did talk through 2 slides without making any changes to the slides. This is what I've just talked to you about, the cycle of how this works specifically, right? So nonviolence and human rights framing to international solidarity to pressure on states for concessions. And again, as you think about this finding and this argument in the context of what we already know about nonviolent resistance from mass campaigns, thinking about this as an alternative pathway, right? None of this is to say that mass nonviolence doesn't work, right? Or that it's not a great opportunity if you can engage in that kind of mobilization. For a lot of people on the ground, I think the idea that you would have to mobilize that many people seems like a barrier. We had a really interesting conversation before the panel about this statistic that floats around that you need 3.5% of the population to mobilize for effective nonviolence. And this, in many ways, 3.5 sounds like a small number. In other ways, if you're working for political change, it's a huge number, right? And it'll maybe be an insurmountable number. And so this idea and these findings that you can get effective nonviolence without that, without high numbers, I think is really important. Okay. Sorry. I think I already told you guys this too. Okay. Let me bring this to our audience here, and why I was so excited to come and talk to this audience with the Institute, and I'm so excited for the work that's being done. The Catholic Church is the kind of actor that I'm talking about in that boomerang, right? It is an actor with an international presence, with a moral authority, and with the ability to call attention to nonviolent resistance, right? And to places where they can identify small-scale nonviolence. We've seen this historically, right? I'm sure in the qualitative cases, we've seen churches writ large playing a role in this. But I think today, as we think about Pope Leo's call for us to think about nonviolence and to understand, its potential role, this becomes even more important, right? To think about the role that the church can play in bringing nonviolence into the light, essentially, and to see that as well. I would not be an academic if I didn't caveat all the things I've just told you. So I want to share a few things before I stop and open up for discussion that I think are maybe not limitations to the argument or undermining the finding, but things to keep in mind. The first is that this public sympathy is not automatic. So the story that I'm telling really hinges on international actors and often international publics, right? So people in different situations seeing nonviolence, seeing a justified struggle, and responding positively. And I am cautiously optimistic that this is how it works in a lot of contexts, but I will say my own work in the United States on nonviolence suggests that this is not always the case. So at least in a country like the United States, there's a huge partisan impact that conditions how people view nonviolent resistance. I also want to note that these tactics aren't themselves morality, right? Nonviolence is not always a tool for just causes. And that we have seen this in contexts in which you have illiberal and authoritarian movements using nonviolent resistance, right? They're also bringing people into the streets. And so it's important for us to carefully think through the means that are being used and the goals that are being pursued, right? And thinking about alignment of those things. Also note just from very recent work that I've done, just coming out this year, the origins and use of nonviolence, I think we've called it here a sticky. And this is something that as actors who may be thinking about, should I work with an organization? What we're finding is that organizations that have a history of using these types of tactics are more likely to do so, even when the going gets rough, right? Even when they're faced with violence. And that's something as we think about supporting nonviolence, it's sort of twofold. One is sort of what can you expect, and another is how do you invest for the future, right? If you want to see more nonviolent action, supporting actors to learn these skills and these tools now, even if you're not seeing an immediate payoff, can be really worthwhile. And then a final one here, I'll note as my fourth caution, is essentially, as we think about how to support different actors, at least what I find from the kinds of cases that I'm interested in, sometimes, and I don't know that this is necessarily a bad thing, when they do achieve their goals or the concessions, they demobilize, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. So it's something to sort of think about is how do powerful actors shape mobilization, shape the trajectory of dissent in their contexts. And sometimes that is with repression, but sometimes it's also by giving a little bit of what people want and sort of buying off sounds normative, but sort of like satisfying a little bit. And so that's another thing to keep in mind in terms of mobilization. All right. So to conclude, I think that the points I would love for you all to take home from this is that nonviolence is common. It can be small, it can be large, it can be successful, even when it does not include mass mobilization. And that international solidarity matters, right? Being able to call on actors outside of your context and get support from them, even if that's just rhetorical support, even if that's media attention, that can be a useful piece in the pathway towards success. Okay, let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gallagher. I think you bring so much in such a short time, and I do have myself many questions, but I won't take the advantage of having the microphone, but I will give you the word to those of you here, if you want to make first any questions or comments. Yeah, Mike.
I do have a question.
Do you want to maybe take the or the one there?
Oh, this.
You can use.
Think that should work?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you, Kathleen. My question has to do with in the area of solidarity that you raised. From your research, does it make a difference if the group or the organization acting for change in their own context invites international solidarity or not? Does it matter?
Yeah, so this question, how or why does it matter if groups invite other actors or solidarity? This is a fascinating question. This is not something that I have looked at real specifically. There are a lot of examples of organizations actively reaching out. In some sense, I think it maybe is also like interdependent, because we see like organizations coalescing that bring together different organizations and sort of like operate in the context. So in the area of sort of both violent and nonviolent organizations, so Geneva Call is one of these types of international sort of, what would we call it, an organization? I don't know, it's not really an organization, but it's like a focal point. And so you do have some focal points where organizations have opportunities to sort of make their claims known and make their commitment to different types of norms known. There's one scholar that maybe would be of interest in moving forward, and this is Reiko Huang, who is at Texas A&M, and I'm happy to share her information. She's been working on official lobbying by non-state actors to governments, and so we do see a lot of that occurring. The organizations that are likely to sort of go from the other direction would be like International Rescue Committee and the sort of the human rights community. And that seems relatively symbiotic, right? That it's not unidirectional, one asking and one responding. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? Yeah, Sila. You can use the microphone. So, yeah. Thank you, Sila.
Is this on now?
Yeah.
I would like you to talk a little bit more about winning can dissolve a movement, because sometimes I think that's it and everything is accomplished, and then the other aspects, for example, even with the apartheid, now they're dealing with a huge unemployment and other conditions that we think just because we took care of the nonviolence aspect, that necessitates it, everything else is being influenced. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you learned in that area, because I think it's really important.
Thank you. So I think this is a really central question for thinking about progress rather than just winning. A lot of the cases that we're interested in these contexts where people are struggling for basic human rights, there's often, a political valence to it. The work that I've done really focuses on autonomy-seeking groups. They're identified as a community. This represents a lot of what we see in the world, but not everything, right? So they can get, concessions that give them more autonomy, but then create other problems. So this, I think, is a real challenge for understanding success. And as a social scientist, my primary thought for this is, well, we better be careful how we're going to code this data. But as a practitioner, right, as a person, sort of living in the world, right, the coding the data is not the most important part. So I think it likely necessitates a reassessment of, even from, where I've, hopefully can say, moved our understanding from, maximal campaign success, regime change, to, concessions and accommodation. Maybe another step needs to go towards quality of life, after the fact, because we do see cases where there's a demobilization, and a few things can happen. Obviously, everything could be wonderful, and that would be great. But there may be persistent challenges in these communities that don't get addressed, or they don't have the tools as readily at hand. Or in some cases, for the kinds of movements that I study, you see a shifting of authority down to the local level, but that doesn't improve people's lives on the ground. So political success for a movement like this might not be a success in terms of human rights. And that's something that I think is, is really important to understand. And one of the pathways through which these movements sort of dissolve is that they become part of conventional politics, right? You end up with a regional parliament, or you get your own political parties. And in that case, you have institutionalized, a way of coping and a way of dealing with these problems that may or may not be particularly effective, right? So then you're asking a new question. I think it's one final thing I'll say about this idea of movement dissolution and remobilization, is that the fragmentation of these movements is also a really important consideration. My first book, which was not on nonviolence, it was actually about the fragmentation of these movements for greater self-determination, and how important that is for understanding these kinds of outcomes, because these movements don't always hang together. Sometimes they separate, and you get acronyms with alphabet soup. You've got your original group plus a name, and then you've got another group plus the year 2000. So you can see the proliferation of these groups as they sort of come under stress, whether through concessions or through repression, and sort of lead to that disillusion, which has implications downstream, right, for how these politics develop. It's not necessarily always good or always bad.
Thank you. Ken.
Dr. Gallagher Cunningham, this was a superb presentation, and I think speaks very directly to what the Catholic Institute for Nonviolence is pursuing here, especially in light of the challenges we face where people, leaders in the church and members of the church, only think of nonviolence in maximal terms, and therefore it doesn't really apply. And that your lens can help us see that the spectrum of nonviolent options and alternatives and dynamics, strategies, are not only something that could happen far in the future, but actually is happening under our noses, but the lens hasn't always been there to see that. Is there, you mentioned that the church's strength, one of the strengths is its role in playing a focus on solidarity regarding human rights violations internationally, for example. Are you or somebody else looking more at those smaller movements and campaigns within the church that are not at the level of some Vatican statement, for example, but at the base, and because that kind of research, which you're forecasting here, would be very, very helpful for what we're doing.
Thank you. This is a fascinating question. I have not personally been working on this with respect to the church, and I don't know anybody that is, but I'm really intrigued by it. I think about my own parish community and the kinds of organizations that arise within it, right? So this has not been something that's been on the radar in that community, but I do see potential for organizing around this. Now, maybe the parish community is maybe smaller than you were even thinking, but certainly, the idea of the localization of, both identification, right, information, trying to figure out when and how these tactics are being used and to what end, and to create solidarity, is much more than just a message on, social media or conventional media from the top levels. One of the challenges, I think, for solidarity writ large, for also research writ large, is the homogenization of media sources. So we see this. I don't know if I can say the extent to which this is true in all contexts, but for example, in the United States, media is consolidated over time into smaller number of powerful actors that then help drive what media covers. And I know this has been, in conflict zones, has been a long time question about bias and what we can see based on what kind of media is allowed to go into different places. Just thinking off the top of my head, the church community is an amazing opportunity to have actors that are in places already and have a perspective on what's going on in communities that is not necessarily shaped by those constraints on media attention. So that, in terms of as we think about, networks of actors, the Catholic Church has a nice network spanning the whole globe, and sort of linking that into more local and then upstream, mobilization for, calling attention is a really interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I will take the opportunity to also bring my own question. You mentioned in your intervention that movements that use nonviolence are about twice as likely to win concessions. And this was very exciting to me as a mediator, because you know that there is a gap for many people understanding the connection of nonviolent action, let's say, and more like negotiation, no? How to go from the streets to the negotiation table. And this data that you present, it intrigues me that if this will help to support the idea that supporting nonviolent action, it helps also to have a peace process or a negotiation process.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent point. Particularly, if we want to sort of think a little bit more about the peace processes writ large, we see a lot of variation in who gets included in peace processes and how the mediation occurs. And I think one of the challenges for a long time in the context of civil conflict was people with guns got to the table, but those were not, there was often more community action that was happening. And so I do think there's been a recognition, through the work in this space that actors using nonviolence can and do play a role in post-conflict settings and and really important for the negotiations. One case I think that is really interesting that I continue to think about and look at is the Colombian peace agreement with the FARC. Right, this has spurred a lot of interesting questions about the role of broader society in supporting conflict end and negotiations. And I think as we see more scholarship coming out on this, it looks to me like more attention is being paid to actors who use nonviolence, and in thinking about how mobilization occurs during conflict, during mediation and after mediation, right? Because we see this need for support across this range of time that is really interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, this is only the beginning of the conversation. We will bring some more. I think we can give a big applause to Dr. Gallagher. Okay, and now I'm really glad to introduce Jonathan Pinky. He's on my right. He's an assistant professor of political science in the School of Economical, Political, and Policy Sciences at the University of Texas. Before, he was also the director of applied research for the Horizons Project, where he led research on countering democratic backsliding. He has also worked as a senior researcher at the United States Institute of Peace, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and an external associate at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. He was also a research fellow at Sichuan Center for International Security and Diplomacy, where he supervised data collection for the Social Conflict Analysis database. His research on civil resistance, democratization, and peace building has been widely published. And his first book, From Dissent to Democracy, The Promise and Peril of Civil Resistance Transition, was published in 2020. Please welcome Dr. Jonathan Pinky. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Nicholas, and thanks so much to Ken and Marie for the invitation to be here, and to Kathleen for such a wonderful first talk to get this discussion going. So what I'm going to focus on in my talk is this question that I appreciate it came up in the discussion already, of what comes after nonviolent resistance. What does nonviolent resistance build? What are, not just in the short-term moment of success, of concession, but over the longer term, after a movement has ended, what actually happens? And what kinds of gains are made and what kinds of gains are not made? And what are some of the complications there? And the screen is dim, so I think you can't really see it too clearly. But I have, as an indicative example up here, Tahrir Square in 2011 during the revolution, which was, I think, has a very personal connection for me as well. This is how I got interested in studying this sort of thing. Because I spent some time in Egypt before the revolution, and when the revolution happened, the shock of it, the surprise of it, got me very excited about understanding how this sort of thing can happen. And then, of course, for those of you who are familiar with the years following, how can things go so wrong afterwards? Why do we have kind of this moment of incredible hope where, you know, the people of a country are coming together to create this moment of transformational change, and then you have, you know, years of political infighting followed by a military coup and a dictatorship that is in many ways even worse than the one that preceded the revolution. And so I was really, you know, I really wanted to better understand, how do we get to this moment? And then how do we get to the moment that came after? And are the gains of nonviolent resistance, when it comes to things like the advancement of democracy and the protection of human rights that came up in the previous talk, when and why are those things actually sustained? So this question of what does nonviolence leave behind after it? And this is particularly critical because, as you can see on the map here, nonviolent resistance has been one of the most significant forces in leading to major political transformations around the world. This data that populates the map is from my 2020 book. that looked at all political transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance from the end of the Second World War up until the Arab Spring. A population of around 80 political transitions in every region of the world, in every kind of political regime, with every kind of different sort of political context. And so just as Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham brought up previously, there are many thousands of smaller movements pursuing nonviolent resistance for reasons of self-determination. There are also huge numbers of major moments of political transformation. Some of them that we are all, we may be familiar with, the Arab Spring, the fall of the Berlin Wall, this sort of thing, but many others whose names we are not familiar with, but nonetheless in their countries of origin led to major transformational political outcomes. And so the first question to start with, and I'm not going to bury the lead here, is the question of, particularly with the example of Egypt in mind that I started with, does this actually lead to positive change? Does this actually lead, when people rise up against a dictatorship, do they actually end up with more democracy, with more protection for their human rights than they had before the revolution? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. The data on this is abundantly clear. This data also comes from my 2020 book, where I looked at those 80 transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance and compared them to around 400 transitions initiated through other means. So whether that be violent revolutions, top-down processes of liberalization, basically anything else that might lead an authoritarian regime to break down. And when a transition is initiated through nonviolent resistance, it ends in at least a minimal level of democracy around 80% of the time. A success rate that is vastly higher than any other method of change. And so again, I think the basic question of are the gains of major nonviolent resistance movements sustained into the future, at least when it comes to questions of democracy, the answer is undoubtedly yes, and the data is very, very clear on this question. But then, of course, a natural question arises, when you present any kind of, basic statistical relationship like this, but why and how, and is this, can we trust this based on what actually happens on the ground, or is this just some kind of strange statistical artifact? So I want to talk a little bit about the reasons why we see this particular relationship. What is the connection between the method of nonviolent resistance and the longer-term outcome of democracy? And I'm going to highlight three mechanisms in particular that lead us from the moment, a moment like Tahrir Square of mass mobilization in the streets to longer-term sustained democratic political institutions. And the first has to do with leaders. So when you initiate a political change through nonviolent resistance, when sort of the major forces that have come together to create political change are, not the leaders of rebel groups or long-term political elites, but people who have been, leading activist organizations or been involved in, these kinds of nonviolent political struggles. These are different kinds of people. These are different sorts of leaders are elevated into positions of political prominence through processes of nonviolent resistance than through other kinds of processes. And so, for instance, I think an excellent example of this is Václav Havel, who you can see pictured on the slide here. Václav Havel, of course, began his career as a playwright. Perhaps not the most obvious career into political influence. but from his position as a playwright, later became involved with groups of artists and intellectuals who were involved in activism. This later led him to a central position in the Velvet Revolution in 1989 that overthrew the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, and later to a position as president of Czechoslovakia, where he was able to oversee not only a transition to democracy, but in what I think is a truly remarkable case, the peaceful separation of Czechoslovakia into two countries, which was by no means something that was automatically determined. As again, Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham's research would show you quite, secession does not happen peacefully in many cases. In most cases, these kinds of demands for national self-determination end in some kind of violent struggle at some point. So this is our first mechanism, that when you have a major moment of political change happening through nonviolent resistance, different kinds of people tend to rise to political prominence. And again, I will, as Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham said, I would not be an academic if I did not caveat everything that I say. I'll have some bigger caveats coming on later. Of course, this is not everyone. There are sort of activist leaders who do not have the democratic coalition building, peace loving credentials of someone like Václav Havel. I'll talk about a couple of them a little bit later. But on average, as opposed to other ways of creating political change, different sorts of leaders tend to rise to prominence in campaigns of nonviolent resistance. Second, because mass nonviolent resistance campaigns, the kind that do lead to regime change, tend to involve large numbers of participants from across political spectrums, from a variety of different kinds of perspectives, those campaigns, in order to succeed, typically rely on compromise and negotiation. Because you have people from many different backgrounds and many different political perspectives who all need to agree that we need to mobilize people into the streets in order to achieve change. And so the process of nonviolent resistance itself tends to elevate norms around compromise, negotiation, and cooperation. That, again, the sort of, the leaders, the organizations, the individuals who have participated in a mass nonviolent resistance campaign gain experience in negotiating their problems rather than fighting through their problems. And this then is, in many ways, we might say, the core of what healthy democracy looks like. That struggles between differing political opinions are not escalated to their extreme, but that they are characterized by negotiation and compromise. And so I think one excellent example of this, which is pictured on the screen here, is the 2006 revolution in Nepal, which overthrew that country's monarchy and initiated a transition to democracy. And one particularly fascinating characteristic of this revolution is that it was preceded by a 10-year civil war in which Maoist revolutionaries, led by the gentleman on the right here, who went by the name Prachanda, had been in the mountains of Nepal, waging a sort of a Maoist revolution for almost a decade. And they had succeeded, as many guerrillas are able to do, in capturing rural areas, but had no capacity to actually take any of Nepal's major cities. And so, in the early 2000s, as kind of their civil war had kind of ground to a stalemate, the Maoist revolutionaries went through this process that Dr. Gallagher-Cunningham brought up before, of saying violence has not been effective for us. This has not worked. We need to find a different path. And so, to achieve that path, they turned to men like the man on the left here, Girija Prasad Koirala, who was the head of the political party, the Nepali Congress, a sort of a political party founded on Gandhian principles, actually originally inspired by the Indian National Congress to the south. and which had been waging a nonviolent struggle for a return to parliamentary democracy in Nepal. And both the Maoist rebels and the mainstream political parties recognized on our own we do not have sufficient power, sufficient leverage to be able to challenge the dictatorship of the king. But together, if we pool our resources, the mainstream political parties in the cities, the Maoists in the country, then we can have sufficient pressure to be able to really challenge the monarchy. And so the two sides agreed to work together in exchange for the Maoists saying, we will pause our armed struggle, we will shift our tactics to nonviolent tactics, and we will work together to achieve the kind of political change that we want to achieve. They were successful, and then in the years following, were able to establish a peace agreement between the two sides and initiate a longer-term political transition. Okay, so elevating different kinds of leaders, changing the sort of norms of political behavior. And finally, and I think in many ways I would say this is perhaps the most crucial, that nonviolent resistance diffuses skills and experience of engaging in political struggle widely throughout society. And again, this relates to the question of participation that Dr. Gallagher Cunningham brought up previously. That the kinds of mass campaigns that tend to lead to regime change and initiating political transitions tend to involve very large numbers of people and a wide range of different kinds of organizations that if in sort of violent struggles or other processes of political change tend to not be politically activated as much. And so when these groups are politically activated, they gain both, I would say, the cognitive liberation, the knowledge that change is possible through these kinds of tactics, the knowledge that they have the power to achieve political change even without the intervention of political elites, and the specific organizing skills around planning the kinds of tactics that can then be used to pressure political elites later on. And so, put all these things together, this set of new kinds of leaders who are likely to be more sympathetic and supportive of democracy, more protective of human rights, norms of cooperation and compromise, and then a society with the knowledge that change is possible and the skills to hold elites to account combines to lead to this democratizing advantage that I started with. Now, this is kind of where my research on the connections between nonviolent resistance and democracy started. In the years since then, I've examined kind of a number of other dimensions related to these longer-term impacts of nonviolent resistance on political institutions. And the picture, I think, I'm going to tell you some more good news before we get to some of the caveats. So in addition to making a minimal level of democracy more likely, nonviolent resistance also improves the quality of democracy. So I think as many of us know, many countries may be called democracies, and yet the protection of human rights, the sort of quality of elections there vary incredibly widely. And so within that subset of countries that are at least minimally democratic, political regimes that have been created through nonviolent resistance tend to have better quality democratic institutions. Their quality of representation tends to be better, and in particular, they tend to have much stronger protections for basic human rights around freedom of expression and freedom of association, which is, I think, intuitive. Again, when one thinks about sort of nonviolent resistance as an initiating force for new political institutions. If the people who are designing your new political system are themselves activists who have suffered violence at the hands of the state, who have been punished for their freedom of expression in the past, they are likely to care a lot about protecting freedom of expression and freedom of association in the new political regime. So nonviolent resistance not only makes democracy just in a broad level more likely when democracy occurs, when democracy occurs, if it occurs through nonviolent resistance, it is also of higher quality. However, another sort of caveat, as we all know, for many, democracies may sort of provide a lot of political inclusion to some groups, but not others. I'm an American. I come from the United States, where many people in our country have suffered from been excluded from political power. Nonviolent resistance also increases the political inclusion of historically excluded groups across a number of dimensions as well. So both increasing sort of the broad level of political inclusion, but also increasing political inclusion along dimensions of gender, class, and ethnicity as well. That political regimes that are come about through nonviolent resistance are more likely to protect the rights of women. They are more likely to have greater economic equality, to provide greater political power to working classes. And also, they are less likely to politically exclude people on the basis of ethnic identity as well. And so, again, I think a lot of good news. Increased democracy, increased democratic equality, increased political inclusion. However, today, of course, many democracies around the world are struggling with the phenomenon of democratic backsliding. That countries that have, in many cases, for many decades, had very strong protections of basic democratic rights, are now seeing rollbacks of those rights and the centralization of executive power in the hands of people like, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and again, now I'm from the United States, President Donald Trump as well. And this is something that I've been doing some more research on more recently. And here too, nonviolent resistance has a powerful effect in protecting against democratic backsliding. This is some research I conducted with my colleague Claire Trilling. We looked at episodes of democratic backsliding from around the world, looked both at the presence of nonviolent resistance and also the outcomes of these sort of episodes of democratic backsliding, periods where democratic institutions are being challenged. And what we found was very clear. When there was no organized nonviolent resistance, the probability that democracy was going to be protected was very, very low. When there is organized nonviolent resistance, the probability that democracy will be protected is much, much higher. Essentially, many of the sort of earlier findings I was showing you are about the transition from authoritarianism to democracy. But even within established democracies, nonviolent resistance remains a crucial protective avenue as well. Okay, so that's all the good news. I want to say a few of those caveats and talk a little bit about some of the challenges a little bit more in these sort of transitions from nonviolence to democracy. So, I showed you this slide at the beginning saying, we have this, wonderful success rate of nonviolent resistance leading to democracy of around 80%. But of course, this means too that around 20% of political transitions that are started through nonviolent resistance don't even reach a very minimal level of democracy. And so what explains that subset? Why do we sometimes, we have, as in Egypt, the example that I started with, we have these sort of major moments of mass mobilization that succeed in ousting a political regime, that succeed in creating a political transition, and yet do not end in democracy. And the argument that I've made both in my book and across much of my work since then is that what explains these differences can largely be attributed to political choices that are made during the transition itself. And so first, I will say the biggest threat, the biggest way in which we see political transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance returning to some form of dictatorship is from within. It is from transitional governments. And there are two variants of that. The first is that transitions initiated through nonviolent resistance, because they don't have this sort of destructive impact of transitions initiated through violence, because they often involve that kind of negotiation, compromise, and collaboration that I was talking about before, they mean also that many times sort of old regime elites, elements of the former dictatorship, are still present and can attempt to overturn the revolution in a counter-revolution. Again, the case of Egypt that I brought up before is an example of this. And yet, there is also a challenge from within the movement itself. This is something that I focused on quite a bit in my recent work, which is that there are cases where, people unlike Václav Havel, people who have at one point been themselves leaders of nonviolent movements, later turn their back on the kinds of protections that they claimed they were fighting for, the democracy and human rights that they in many cases suffered significantly for, and once in power, they overturn the political regimes that they helped create. And in sort of a paper that is under review right at the moment, so we'll see what happens with that. Some co-authors and I find that the biggest factor that explains this is, it can be said quite simply, it is the corrupting influence of power. It is that the biggest predictor of whether former activists will overturn democracy after a political transition has happened is the degree of power and influence that they have during the political transition. For my book, I